A $2 bottle from the grocery store just brought over 1,000 earthworms crawling to the surface in 72 hours. It outperformed $50 worth of chemical fertilizer. And it is something the gardening industry has never once told you about. Let that sink in for a moment. Welcome back to Rooted in Grace, friends. That quiet little corner where we dig into the soil and, every now and then, into the deeper truths of life itself. Now, if you're watching this, chances are you already know the feeling. That peace of a cool morning in the garden, the smell of damp earth after a rain, the simple joy of watching something you planted actually grow. But I also know another feeling, and I bet you know it too. You've done everything right. You followed the advice. You bought the products they told you to buy. You watered faithfully, and still, the soil just sits there, hard, dusty, lifeless. You pick it up, and instead of crumbling like rich, dark cake, it feels like concrete. If that sounds familiar, I need you to hear this. You have not failed. What if the very things we were told would fix our gardens were actually making them worse? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on something remarkable. There is a simple, dark liquid that costs less than $2. It is not some fancy chemical formula. It does not come in flashy packaging. But when you pour it onto dead, compacted soil, something extraordinary happens. Earthworms appear by the hundreds within just 3 days. The soil structure starts changing within a week, and within a month, ground that was completely lifeless transforms into dark, crumbly, living earth. This one everyday liquid outperforms chemical products that cost 50 times as much. And there is a very good reason why a $70 billion industry does not want you to know about it. Stay with me. By the end of this, you will never look at your garden the same way again.
Part 1. The biggest mistake we were all taught to make. Before I show you the cure, we need to understand the illness. And this one goes back decades. Let me ask you something. Do you remember when gardening was simpler? When your grandparents or great-grandparents just worked the land with compost, manure, and common sense, and things grew beautifully. Then came the years after World War II, the chemical revolution. Suddenly, there were bags of synthetic NPK fertilizer on every shelf, and we were told this was the modern, scientific way to feed our plants. The old methods? Dismissed as primitive, outdated, unnecessary. And here is what nobody told us. Synthetic fertilizers completely bypass the natural biology of the soil. They deliver nutrients directly to the roots in a harsh, soluble chemical form. Sure, your plants might get a quick burst of green, like a person getting a jolt of energy from a strong cup of coffee. But what is happening underneath? You see, good soil is never just dirt. It is a living city. Millions of bacteria, fungi, tiny organisms all working together to break down organic matter and cycle nutrients to your plants naturally. It is a partnership that has existed for millions of years. But when we pour synthetic fertilizers on our gardens, we break that partnership. The plants stop needing the microbes. The microbes begin to starve. And here is the part that really gets me. The salts in those chemical fertilizers actually pull water out of the soil organisms. They kill the very life that makes soil healthy. Every single application does a little more damage. Within just a few seasons, the rich biology that took decades to build simply dies. Your soil stops being a living ecosystem and becomes nothing more than a lifeless sponge holding chemicals. And that creates a trap. Fewer microbes mean less natural fertility. Less natural fertility means you need to buy more fertilizer.
More fertilizer kills more biology.
It is a cycle of dependency, and it is very, very profitable for the companies selling those bags. But what if we could break that cycle? What if the answer was already sitting in your kitchen? Part 2. The secret in your pantry. All right, here it is. The liquid that breaks this cycle. The liquid that brings dead soil roaring back to life. It is Blackstrap Molasses. I know, I can almost see you raising an eyebrow right now. Molasses? That old-fashioned pantry ingredient Grandma used in gingerbread? Yes. But before you dismiss it, let me tell you what Blackstrap Molasses actually is, because there is something almost poetic about it. When sugarcane is harvested, the juice is boiled to pull out the white sugar. The first boiling gives you a sweet, light syrup. Then they boil it again. And again. By the third and final boiling, nearly all the superficial white sugar has been removed. And what is left behind? A thick, dark, heavy liquid. That is Blackstrap Molasses. Now here is what makes this so fascinating. The world extracts the quick sweetness and throws away the rest. But everything truly valuable stayed behind in that dark residue. All the iron, calcium, magnesium, potassium, manganese, zinc, the minerals that were in the original plant, they are all concentrated right there. Just 1 tablespoon contains up to 20% of your daily requirement for some of these essential minerals. Think about that for a moment. The refined white sugar gets all the attention. But the deep, dark substance that endured the fire, the one most people overlook, that is where the real strength lives. You know, those of us who have lived a few decades understand this better than anyone. The world celebrates the quick energy and the shine of youth, just like it celebrates white sugar. But it is in the later seasons of life, after we've been through the fire, after we've been boiled down by experience, that the real minerals of wisdom and resilience are concentrated. Blackstrap Molasses is the elder of the sugar world, and what remains is rich, deep, and absolutely essential. When you introduce this mineral-rich liquid back into the soil, it acts as what scientists call a chelating agent. In plain English, it unlocks nutrients that were stuck in the ground, making them available again to your plants and the soil life around them. You are not just pouring a liquid. You are pouring concentrated resilience back into the earth. But what happens next underground? That is where the real miracle begins. Part 3. The discovery that changed everything. Now, you might be wondering, do the plant roots actually eat the molasses? And the surprising answer is no. Plants do not absorb the sugar directly. The molasses feeds the invisible biology living around the roots. And this leads us to something that honestly sounds like science fiction, but it is real. It has been confirmed by researchers, and it completely changes how we think about plants. It is called the Rhizophagy Cycle. Now, that is a big word, so let me break it down simply. For generations, we thought plants were passive. They just sat there, quietly drinking up whatever minerals happened to dissolve in the soil water. Right? Wrong. Research led by Dr. James White has shown us something incredible. Plants actually farm microbes. The same way we raise livestock for food, plants raise bacteria for nutrients. Here is how it works in plain terms. A healthy plant releases sugars and acids from its root tips, like putting out a dinner invitation. Bacteria in the soil smell that invitation and swarm toward the roots. And then the plant does something astonishing.
It absorbs those living bacteria right into its own root cells, whole. Once inside, the plant gives those bacteria a kind of chemical bath that strips off their outer coats and releases the nutrients they're carrying. Nitrogen, potassium, all the good stuff. The plant takes what it needs. But, and this is the beautiful part, it does not kill them. After extracting the nutrients, the plant grows a tiny root hair and uses it almost like a syringe to push those bacteria back out into the soil. The bacteria rebuild themselves, gather more nutrients from the earth, and come right back to the root to do it all over again. An endless cycle of life feeding life. And here is exactly where our Blackstrap molasses comes in. When you apply molasses to the soil, you are handing the bacteria a massive energy boost.
You are giving them the carbohydrates they need to multiply, rebuild, and get back to work for your plants faster. You are taking the burden off the plant itself, allowing it to focus its energy on what you want: healthy leaves, strong stems, and delicious fruit. Without these microbes, plants cannot even form their root hairs properly. They become weak and stressed. But with them, fed and thriving, your garden becomes a self-sustaining engine of life. Now, I know that was a lot of science, but here is the takeaway that matters. Your plants are not helpless. They are designed to farm their own food. They just need the right partners in the soil. And molasses is the fuel that powers that entire partnership. But what happens on day 3? That is when things get truly dramatic.
Part 4, when the earthworms come here, is something I want you to remember, because it is one of the most hopeful things I have ever learned about gardening. When you look at hard, dry, barren soil, it is easy to think, this ground is dead. Nothing will ever grow here again. But science tells us a different story. That soil is not dead. It is dormant. It is sleeping. It is waiting for the right nourishment that years of chemical treatment took away. Blackstrap molasses is roughly 55% sugar. For soil bacteria that have been starving for years, this is like setting a feast on an empty table. Within just 48 hours of applying molasses, researchers have measured up to 1,000-fold increase in bacterial populations. 1,000-fold. Let that number land. And those bacteria are just the first guests at the table. As they multiply, they become food for protozoa. The protozoa feed the nematodes. It is a chain reaction of life waking up. Then, around day 3, comes the moment that will make you stop what you're doing and just stare at the ground. The earthworms arrive. They do not trickle in. They can appear by the hundreds, sometimes by the thousands. And here is the question everyone asks. Where did they come from? You did not buy them. You did not order them online. They were there all along, surviving deep underground, far below the surface, hiding from the chemicals and the drought and the compaction. Earthworms are incredibly sensitive creatures. When that massive bacterial bloom begins near the surface, it sends a chemical signal downward through the soil. The worms detect it. They smell the abundance, and they begin migrating upward toward the feast. There is a fascinating study on the earthworm species Fertilizer peguana that found when organic waste was mixed with molasses at a ratio of 1:15, the worms achieved complete decomposition of the waste in just 3 days. Without the molasses, the same job took over 9 days.
The molasses did not just attract them, it tripled their efficiency. And once those worms are working in your soil, the transformation accelerates. Every tunnel they dig becomes a channel for oxygen and water to penetrate compacted ground. Their castings, what they leave behind, are some of the most perfectly balanced, nutrient-rich plant food on Earth.
You do not have to force the worms to come. You do not have to drag life to the surface. You simply create the conditions of warmth and nourishment, and life rises up on its own. And you know, I think that is true for more than just gardens. When we offer warmth, grace, and genuine nourishment to the people around us, the best in them comes out of hiding too. But if this works so well and it costs almost nothing, why hasn't anyone told us?
Part 5. Follow the money. This is the question that kept me up at night. If Blackstrap molasses is this effective, this cheap, this simple, why is it not on the front page of every gardening magazine? Why is it not on the shelf of every hardware store? And the answer, friends, is painfully simple. It is not a conspiracy. It is just business. The global synthetic fertilizer industry generates over $70 billion every single year. A handful of massive corporations, companies like Nutrien, Mosaic, and CF Industries, control the vast majority of that market. And here is the thing about their business model. It only works if you keep coming back. Think about it. When you use synthetic fertilizer, it degrades your soil biology. Because the natural systems that generate fertility have been destroyed, you have to buy more fertilizer next season just to keep things growing. And the season after that. And the season after that. That dependency is the entire foundation of their revenue. Between 2020 and 2022, wholesale fertilizer prices shot up over 132%. These companies pointed to supply chain issues, but when reporters looked at their own financial documents, they found record-breaking profit margins. They were not just passing on costs, they were profiting enormously from the dependency they created. Now, when you rebuild your soil biology with a $2 bottle of molasses, something very inconvenient happens for those companies. Your garden starts healing itself. The bacteria multiply. The worms reproduce. A single worm can produce dozens of offspring in one season. Your soil begins generating its own natural fertility. You stop needing to buy their products. A self-sufficient gardener using a $2 grocery store item is a customer permanently lost. They do not attack molasses publicly because doing so would acknowledge its power. Instead, they rely on something more effective: silence. Agricultural media, university extensions, Gardening publications. Many of these receive funding from the very companies selling synthetic fertilizers. The information about cheap, organic alternatives simply does not get amplified. That silence is not an accident. But today, we are breaking it. Part 6. How to do this in your own garden. All right, this is the part you have been waiting for. Let me walk you through exactly how to bring your soil back to life. It is simple, but there are a few things you need to get right. Step 1. The mix. Your golden ratio is 1 to 2 tablespoons of Blackstrap molasses per gallon of water. That is it. But here is something important. Make sure it is unsulfured Blackstrap molasses. This matters. Some brands add sulfur dioxide as a preservative, and sulfur dioxide kills microbes. That is the exact opposite of what we are doing. Look for unsulfured on the label. Step 2. The water. Now, here is a mistake I do not want you to make, and it is the most common one. If you use water straight from the city tap, it almost certainly contains chlorine. Chlorine is designed to kill bacteria in your pipes. Pour that onto your soil, and it will kill the very biology you are trying to wake up. The fix is easy. Fill a bucket with tap water
and let it sit uncovered in the sun for 24 hours. The chlorine will evaporate naturally. If you are in a hurry, a tiny pinch of vitamin C powder will neutralize it almost instantly. Step 3. The application. Apply 1 gallon of your molasses water for every 10 square feet of garden. The best time is early morning or late evening when the sun is gentle. Because soil microbes are only active in warm soil, the ideal window is spring through early fall, when soil temperatures are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And one more thing. Water your garden lightly before and after you apply the molasses mix. Bacteria cannot swim through dry dirt. They need moisture to carry the molasses deep into the root zone where it matters most. A warning. Now, I know some of you are thinking, if a little is good, a lot must be better. I've been there. Resist that urge. If you pour in too much molasses at once, you will trigger such an aggressive microbial bloom that it consumes all the oxygen in the soil.
The ground will start smelling sour and swampy. Even worse, those rapidly multiplying bacteria will gobble up all the available nitrogen to build their own bodies, leaving your plants pale and starving. It is called nitrogen tie-up, and it is a common beginner mistake. Gentle and steady. That is the way. Bonus, the power combination. For even more spectacular results, combine your molasses water with compost tea. The compost brings a fresh army of diverse microbes, and the molasses gives them the energy to get to work immediately. Together, they are a recipe for complete ecological revival in your garden. So let me say it one more time, nice and simple. 1 to 2 tablespoons of unsulfured Blackstrap molasses. 1 gallon of dechlorinated water. 10 square feet. Morning or evening. Water before and after. That is it. That is the whole recipe. Friends, we are standing at a crossroads today. On one side, you can keep doing what we have all been doing, pouring expensive chemicals onto soil that gets a little more lifeless every year, fighting nature instead of working with it, staying dependent on an industry that profits from that dependency. On the other side, you walk into a grocery store, you spend $2 on a bottle of Blackstrap molasses, and you change everything. Imagine this. 1 week from today, you step outside. You push your fingers into the soil, and for the first time in years, it crumbles. It is soft. It is dark. It is alive. And it cost you less than a cup of coffee. Within days, the worms will return. Within weeks, the hard dirt will soften into living, breathing earth. The dependency ends. The health returns. You are no longer just growing plants. You are growing life. And here is what I find most beautiful about all of this. Those of us in the later seasons of our own lives, we carry something the world desperately needs. We carry the deep, rich, concentrated wisdom of everything we have been through, the molasses of our own lived experience. And when we pour that out into our families, our grandchildren, our communities, life rises up. Just like those earthworms climbing toward the light. The $70 billion industry hopes this information stops right here in this video. But it does not have to. Not if you share it. Try this yourself this week. Watch the miracle happen with your own eyes. Then tell someone you love about it. Thank you for spending your time with me here at Rooted in Grace. If this spoke to you, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and pass this along to a friend who needs to hear it. Together, we can uncover the simple, hidden truths of this beautiful world. May your gardens be rich, may your soil be alive, and may your days be deeply rooted in grace. Until next time, God bless.